Close your eyes and imagine stepping through the stone archways of the Colosseum on a warm Roman afternoon. The crowds have long since departed, their thunderous roars now just whispers in the wind. As you settle into your favorite position for sleep tonight, let me take you on a gentle journey back through time to explore one of history's most misunderstood professions. You might think being a gladiator was all glory and fame, but the reality was far more complex, far more human, and far more challenging than Hollywood would have you believe. Tonight, as we drift together through the dusty arenas and training grounds of ancient Rome, you'll discover why, despite the occasional glory, you truly wouldn't want to trade places with these warriors of the sand. So let your breathing slow, allow your muscles to relax, and prepare to journey into a world where survival was never guaranteed, where freedom was a distant dream, and where every dawn brought uncertainty. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, gently tap that like button to let me know. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to Doze Through History for more restful adventures through time. Now, let's begin our story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Ludus, the gladiator training school, as Marcus stirred on his thin straw mattress. The stone walls around him were cold and damp, bearing the scratches and marks of countless men who had slept in this same cell before him. Some had carved their names, others had marked the days until their next fight, and still others had simply clawed at the stone in moments of desperation. Marcus wasn't born to be a gladiator. Few were. Like most of his fellow fighters, he had arrived at this place through circumstances beyond his control. Perhaps he had been captured in one of Rome's endless wars, torn from his family and homeland to be sold in the great slave markets. Or maybe he had fallen into debt so crushing that he had no choice but to sell himself into this life of mortal combat. Some gladiators were criminals, condemned to the arena as punishment, while others were prisoners of war who chose the sword over certain death. As Marcus rose from his bed, his body ached from yesterday's training. Every muscle carried the memory of wooden swords striking shields, of endless hours practicing the same deadly movements until they became as natural as breathing. His hands were calloused and scarred. His arms bore the marks of countless training wounds, and his back ached from carrying the heavy practice weapons that would prepare him for the real thing. The Ludus where Marcus lived was more prison than school. High walls topped with spikes prevented escape, and armed guards watched every movement. The gladiators slept in small, cramped cells, often sharing space with rats and insects. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist here. Every moment of every day was controlled by the lanista, the owner of the school, who viewed his gladiators not as human beings but as investments to be protected and trained until they could generate profit in the arena. If you're feeling relaxed and enjoying this journey, remember to subscribe to Doze Through History and ring that notification bell so you never miss our peaceful travels through time. Let your breathing deepen as we continue Marcus's story. The day began before dawn with the harsh clang of a bronze bell. Sleep was often the only escape these men had from their reality, and it was always cut short. Marcus and his fellow gladiators would shuffle from their cells to the training yard, where their day of preparation for possible death would begin. Breakfast was a simple affair: barley porridge, perhaps some beans, and if they were fortunate, a small piece of bread. The food was designed to keep them alive and strong, nothing more. Gladiators were sometimes called hordearii, barley eaters, because their diet consisted mainly of grains that would build bulk and strength. They needed the carbohydrates for energy, but the meals were monotonous and rarely satisfying. After the morning meal came the training that would consume most of their waking hours. The training yard was a rectangle of sand surrounded by high walls, much like a smaller version of the arenas where they would eventually fight. Here, under the watchful eyes of veteran gladiators who served as instructors, Marcus would spend hours perfecting his technique with wooden weapons called rudis. The training was methodical and repetitive. First came the physical conditioning, running laps around the yard until their lungs burned, lifting heavy stones to build strength, and practicing acrobatic movements that might save their lives in combat. Then came weapons training, starting with basic strikes and blocks, moving gradually to more complex combinations and tactics. Each type of gladiator had their own specialized training regimen. The heavily armored Murmillo, with his distinctive fish-shaped helmet crest, trained differently than the lightly armored retiarius with his net and trident. Marcus was training to be a secutor, a chaser, whose role was typically to hunt down the net-wielding retiarius in combat. His helmet was smooth and rounded to prevent nets from catching on it, and his training focused on quick, aggressive attacks. Let your mind wander as you imagine the warm Roman sun beating down on this training yard, the rhythmic sound of wooden weapons striking shields, the quiet concentration of men preparing for their uncertain futures. Marcus often wondered about the economics that kept this system running. Gladiators were expensive investments for their owners. The initial cost of purchasing a slave or prisoner was just the beginning. Then came months or even years of training, feeding, housing, and medical care before the gladiator was ready for the arena. A skilled gladiator trainer, or magister, commanded high wages, and the weapons and armor needed for combat were crafted by specialist artisans at considerable expense. The ludus where Marcus lived housed nearly 200 gladiators, each representing a significant financial investment. The lanista who owned the school had to carefully balance the books, training his gladiators well enough to win fights and earn prize money, but not so well that they became too expensive to risk in combat. It was a delicate calculation of human lives and gold coins. The gladiators themselves rarely saw much of the money their combat generated. Prize money from victories went to their owners, though successful gladiators might receive small bonuses or better living conditions. Some gladiators could eventually earn enough to purchase their freedom, but this was rare and required surviving many, many fights, something that few men managed to do. The crowds that filled the amphitheaters paid admission fees that supported this entire system. Wealthy Romans would sponsor games as a way to gain political favor and popular support. The more spectacular the games, the more prestige the sponsor gained. This created constant pressure for more elaborate and dangerous spectacles, which in turn meant more risk for the gladiators who provided the entertainment. As you listen to this story, feel your body sinking deeper into comfort, your breathing becoming more regular and peaceful. If you're enjoying these historical journeys that help you sleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History. Perhaps the hardest part of gladiator life wasn't the physical training or even the risk of death, but the psychological burden of living under constant threat. Marcus had watched friends and training partners leave for the arena, never to return. He had seen men break under the pressure, becoming withdrawn and silent, or conversely, becoming recklessly aggressive as a way of coping with their fear. The gladiators developed their own brotherhood, born of shared suffering and mutual dependence. They formed friendships that were deeper than family bonds, knowing that they might be forced to fight each other to the death. This created a complex web of loyalty and potential betrayal that added another layer of stress to their already difficult lives. Sleep came hard in the gladiator barracks. Men would lie awake wondering if tomorrow would bring news of their next fight, if they would live to see another sunset, if they would ever see their families again. Some turned to religion, praying to various gods for protection or for a quick death if defeat was inevitable. Others found solace in small rituals, sharpening their weapons, writing letters they could never send, or simply staring at the stars through the small windows of their cells. The uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their lives. A gladiator might go months without fighting, living in relative safety but constant anxiety, only to be suddenly informed that he would fight the next day. There was no way to mentally prepare for such randomness, no way to plan or hope beyond the immediate moment. Marcus had learned to live one day at a time, finding small pleasures where he could, a particularly good meal, a moment of laughter with a fellow gladiator, the satisfaction of mastering a new fighting technique. These tiny victories against despair were sometimes all that kept him going. When the day finally came for Marcus to fight in the arena, the experience was unlike anything his training had prepared him for. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators, and their collective voice was like the roar of some massive beast. The sound hit him like a physical force as he emerged from the underground tunnels into the blazing sunlight of the arena floor. The arena itself was a marvel of engineering. Beneath the sandy floor lay a complex network of tunnels, elevators, and trapdoors that could produce wild animals, elaborate stage settings, or additional fighters at a moment's notice. The sand on the floor served a practical purpose. It absorbed the blood of combat, though it had to be raked and replaced regularly during longer spectacles. The fights were carefully choreographed entertainment as much as they were combat. Different types of gladiators were matched against each other to create visually interesting contests. The heavily armored Murmillo against the quick Retiarius, the mounted gladiator against the warrior on foot. The goal wasn't simply to kill as quickly as possible, but to provide a spectacle that would entertain the crowd and justify the expense of the games. Marcus's first fight was against a veteran gladiator who had survived over a dozen combats. The crowd cheered not for Marcus, the unknown newcomer, but for his experienced opponent, whose name they chanted with enthusiasm. This taught Marcus an important lesson about arena politics. Popularity with the crowd could mean the difference between life and death. A gladiator who entertained the audience might be spared even in defeat, while one who bored them might be condemned to die regardless of his fighting skill. Let your breathing slow as you imagine the warm sand beneath bare feet, the distant sound of crowds fading into a gentle murmur, your muscles relaxing as you sink deeper into rest. One aspect of gladiator life that's often overlooked is the medical care they received. Because gladiators were valuable property, their owners invested heavily in keeping them healthy and treating their injuries. The medical care available to gladiators was actually superior to what most Romans could access. Each ludus employed skilled physicians who specialized in treating combat wounds. These doctors developed advanced techniques for dealing with cuts, broken bones, and internal injuries. They understood the importance of proper nutrition for healing and recovery, and they had access to the best medical supplies available in the ancient world. Marcus had experienced this medical care firsthand during his training. A practiced sword had opened a deep gash on his sword arm, and the ludus physician had cleaned and stitched the wound with a skill that impressed even the hardened gladiators. The doctor had explained that a gladiator's body was like a racehorse, valuable only if kept in peak condition. However, this medical care came with a price. Gladiators who were injured too frequently or who took too long to heal might find themselves relegated to less favorable fighting assignments or even sold to a less prestigious ludus. The medical care was motivated by economics, not compassion, and the gladiators were always aware of this distinction. The physicians also served another function. They were often the ones who determined whether a defeated gladiator in the arena should live or die. When a gladiator fell and the crowd called for judgment, a doctor would examine the wounded fighter and advise the game sponsor on whether the gladiator could survive his wounds. This medical assessment often carried as much weight as the crowd's opinion in determining the gladiator's fate. Despite the harsh realities of gladiator life, there was always the distant possibility of freedom. A gladiator who survived long enough and fought well enough might eventually earn his wooden sword, the rudus, which symbolized his release from the obligation to fight. This was the dream that kept many gladiators going through their darkest moments. The path to freedom was not easy or certain. A gladiator typically needed to survive at least several years of regular combat, winning more fights than he lost and maintaining popularity with the crowds. Even then, his owner had to be willing to grant freedom, which meant giving up a valuable asset. Some gladiators earned enough prize money to purchase their freedom, but this required exceptional success over many years. Marcus knew gladiators who had won their freedom only to discover that life outside the ludus was almost as difficult as life within it. Former gladiators often found it hard to integrate back into regular Roman society. They were marked by their profession, and many Romans viewed them with suspicion or disdain despite having cheered for them in the arena. Some freed gladiators became trainers themselves, passing on their skills to new generations of fighters. Others tried to start new lives in distant parts of the empire where their past might not follow them. A few even chose to return to gladiatorial combat as free men, finding that the arena was the only life they truly knew. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that freedom, when it came, often felt like another kind of prison. The skills that kept a man alive in the arena, violence, aggression, the ability to kill, weren't easily adapted to peaceful civilian life. Many freed gladiators struggled with what we might now recognize as trauma, carrying the psychological scars of their experiences long after their physical wounds had healed. If you're finding peace in this journey through ancient Rome, please consider subscribing to Doze Through History, and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to explore in your journey to sleep. Within the ludus, a complex social hierarchy governed every aspect of daily life. At the top were the veteran gladiators who had survived many fights and earned the respect of their peers. These men often served as informal leaders and mentors to newer gladiators, sharing crucial knowledge about survival, combat techniques, and arena politics. Marcus learned early to respect this hierarchy. The veterans had earned their status through surviving what most men could not, and their experience was literally life-saving knowledge. They knew which fighting styles worked best against which opponents, how to read a crowd's mood, and how to fall in a way that might convince spectators you were more seriously injured than you actually were. Below the veterans were the established gladiators, men who had fought several times and proven themselves competent, if not exceptional. These gladiators formed the backbone of any ludus, reliable fighters who could be counted on to provide good entertainment without being so valuable that their loss would be catastrophic. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the new arrivals like Marcus, the Tirones or recruits who had not yet proven themselves in actual combat. These men received the worst food, the most cramped sleeping quarters, and the harshest training regimens. They were expendable and everyone knew it, including themselves. This hierarchy wasn't just about status, it was about survival. Veterans could offer protection and guidance to newer gladiators, while those at the bottom of the hierarchy often found themselves selected for the most dangerous fights or paired against overwhelming opponents. Learning to navigate these social dynamics was as important as learning to fight. Some gladiators formed small groups or partnerships, watching each other's backs and sharing resources. These alliances could mean the difference between life and death, but they also created complications when friends might be forced to fight each other in the arena. The day of a gladiatorial game began with elaborate rituals that helped transform ordinary men into entertainers willing to risk death for the crowd's pleasure. Marcus learned that these ceremonies served multiple purposes. They built excitement among the spectators. They provided time for last-minute betting, and they gave the gladiators a chance to mentally prepare for what might be their final performance. The morning of his first real fight, Marcus joined the other gladiators in the ritual inspection of weapons and armor. Each piece of equipment was carefully examined by officials to ensure it met the standards for fair combat. The weapons were real and sharp, unlike the wooden training swords, but they were also balanced to provide good entertainment value rather than quick kills. Before entering the arena, the gladiators participated in what might be their last meal, a banquet called the Cena Libera. This feast was open to the public, giving spectators a chance to see the fighters up close and perhaps place more informed bets on the next day's contests. For the gladiators, it was an opportunity to eat well, possibly for the last time. Marcus found the Cena Libera to be one of the strangest experiences of his life. Citizens who would be cheering for his death in a few hours now approached him with curiosity and even admiration. Some asked for his autograph or a lock of his hair as a memento. Others offered him advice or told him they would be betting on his victory. The disconnect between this friendly interaction and the deadly serious business of the next day was jarring. After the banquet, the gladiators returned to their quarters for what might be their final night. Some spent these hours in prayer, others in quiet conversation with friends, and still others in solitary contemplation. Marcus found that he couldn't sleep, his mind racing through everything he had learned in training, trying to anticipate what the next day would bring. Let yourself imagine that warm Roman evening, the quiet conversations of men facing uncertainty, the gentle sounds of the city settling into night. Allow your own mind to settle as we continue this peaceful journey through time. Understanding the crowd was as crucial to a gladiator's survival as understanding combat techniques. The 50,000 spectators in the Colosseum weren't a uniform mass. They were a complex social organism with distinct groups, preferences, and behaviors that a smart gladiator could learn to read and influence. The crowd's composition varied depending on who was sponsoring the games and what types of contests were featured. The wealthy sat in the lower tiers, closer to the action, while the poor crowded into the upper levels. Women, slaves, and foreigners had their own designated sections. Each group had different preferences for what they wanted to see in the arena. Marcus learned that the wealthy spectators often preferred more sophisticated combat, technical skill, clever tactics, and demonstrations of courage in the face of defeat. They had seen many games and considered themselves connoisseurs of gladiatorial combat. Impressing this audience required subtlety and style, not just brute force. The common people, on the other hand, often wanted spectacle and drama. They cheered for underdogs, loved comebacks, and weren't shy about expressing their opinions loudly. A gladiator who could connect with this larger portion of the audience had a better chance of survival, since their voices often swayed the overall mood of the crowd. The interaction between gladiator and crowd was a complex dance of performance and response. A skilled gladiator would acknowledge the crowd's cheers, salute sections that were supporting him, and even play up his injuries to gain sympathy. The crowd, in turn, would respond to these gestures, creating a feedback loop that could determine the outcome of a fight. Marcus discovered that sometimes the crowd's reaction had little to do with fighting skill and everything to do with showmanship. A gladiator who fought brilliantly but without flair might be condemned to death in defeat, while one who fought poorly but entertained the audience might be spared. This added another layer of complexity to combat. Gladiators had to be both warriors and performers. The crowd's bloodlust wasn't constant or uniform. Early in a day of games, they might be more merciful, sparing defeated gladiators who had fought well. But as the day wore on and the excitement built, they often became more demanding, more eager to see death. Understanding these rhythms could help a gladiator time his most impressive moves for maximum impact. The gladiatorial games existed within a complex economic system that touched every level of Roman society. From the emperor who sponsored the grandest spectacles to the humble vendor selling snacks in the stands, everyone had a financial stake in the success of these deadly entertainments. For the wealthy Romans who sponsored games, the investment was enormous but potentially worthwhile. A successful series of games could launch a political career, secure popular support, or simply enhance one's social standing. The cost included not just the gladiators and their equipment, but also the wild animals, the elaborate stage settings, the prizes and gifts thrown to the crowd, and the massive logistical operation required to put on such events. The gladiators themselves were just one component in this economic machine, but they were often the most expensive. A skilled gladiator represented years of investment in training, food, medical care, and equipment. Losing such a fighter in the arena was a significant financial blow to his owner, which is why gladiatorial games had rules designed to prevent unnecessary deaths. Marcus learned that most gladiatorial contests weren't actually fights to the death. The majority of gladiators survived their arena appearances, though they often carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Death in the arena, while always a possibility, was more often the result of accident or particularly vicious combat than deliberate execution. The betting that surrounded gladiatorial games created another layer of economic complexity. Spectators wagered enormous sums on their favorite fighters, and these bets could influence everything from the matchmaking to the crowd's reaction to a particular gladiator. A fighter who was heavily bet against might face a hostile crowd regardless of his skill or effort. This economic web meant that gladiators were constantly being evaluated not just as fighters, but as investments, entertainers, and symbols. Their value fluctuated based on their recent performance, their popularity with crowds, their health, and even broader political and social trends within the empire. As you continue to relax and drift deeper into peaceful sleep, remember to subscribe to Doze Through History if you're enjoying these gentle journeys through ancient times. The training regimen that consumed Marcus's days was designed to prepare gladiators for every conceivable scenario they might face in the arena. This went far beyond simple weapons practice to include psychology, showmanship, and even how to die with dignity if defeat became inevitable. Physical conditioning formed the foundation of all gladiator training. Marcus's day began before dawn with running, not just around the training yard, but longer distances that built the cardiovascular endurance needed for sustained combat. A fight in the arena might last anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, and a gladiator who tired first was usually a dead gladiator. Strength training involved lifting heavy stones, wrestling with other gladiators, and practicing with weapons that were deliberately heavier than those used in actual combat. This meant that when a gladiator finally held a real sword or shield in the arena, it would feel light and manageable by comparison. Flexibility and agility training helped gladiators avoid their opponent's attacks and recover quickly from falls or stumbles. Marcus spent hours each day practicing rolls, jumps, and other acrobatic movements that might save his life in combat. The sand of the arena could be treacherous, and maintaining balance while fighting was a skill that required constant practice. Weapon training was highly specialized. Each type of gladiator used different equipment and tactics, and the training reflected these differences. The retiarius with his net and trident trained differently than the heavily armored secutor, who in turn had different needs than the mounted gladiator or the fighter who battled wild animals. Marcus's training as a secutor focused on aggressive, forward-moving attacks designed to prevent his typical opponent, the retiarius, from using his net effectively. He learned to move in straight lines, to keep his shield positioned to block the three-pronged trident, and to close distance rapidly to negate his opponent's reach advantage. But perhaps the most difficult part of training was learning to fight other human beings with the intent to kill or be killed. Most of the men in the ludus had been soldiers, criminals, or slaves. Few had been murderers. Learning to overcome the natural reluctance to take human life required psychological conditioning as much as physical training. Despite the competitive nature of their profession, gladiators often formed remarkably close bonds with their fellow fighters. These relationships were forged in the unique crucible of shared danger and mutual dependence that characterized life in the Ludus. Marcus's closest friend was a Germanic tribesman named Flavius, who had been captured in one of Rome's northern campaigns. Despite speaking different languages and coming from vastly different cultures, the two men found common ground in their shared circumstances and mutual respect for each other's fighting abilities. These friendships provided crucial emotional support in a world where death was always a possibility. Gladiators would comfort each other after defeats, celebrate each other's victories, and provide encouragement during the grueling training sessions. They shared food when rations were short, tended each other's wounds, and kept each other's spirits up during the long periods between fights. The brotherhood extended beyond mere friendship to include practical cooperation. Veteran gladiators taught newcomers techniques that could save their lives, shared intelligence about upcoming opponents, and sometimes even provided financial support to help a fellow gladiator purchase better equipment or medical care. But these relationships also carried a terrible burden: the knowledge that they might someday be forced to fight each other in the arena. The lanista who owned the Ludus might decide that a fight between two popular gladiators would be particularly entertaining, or the sponsors of the games might specifically request such a match. Marcus and Flavius had discussed this possibility during many long evenings in their cell. They had agreed that if such a fight ever occurred, they would give their best effort for the crowd's entertainment, but would try to ensure that the loser survived. It was a pact that many gladiator friendships included, though everyone knew that the arena had a way of making such noble intentions irrelevant. The emotional toll of these relationships was enormous. Marcus had watched friends die in training accidents, succumb to infected wounds, or simply disappear one day to fight in distant arenas, never to be seen again. Each loss was a reminder of his own mortality and the fragility of any happiness he managed to find in this life. When Marcus finally faced his first real opponent in the arena, he discovered that all his training could only partly prepare him for the reality of combat with deadly weapons. The psychological pressure of fighting for his life in front of thousands of screaming spectators was unlike anything he had experienced in the relative safety of the training yard. His opponent was a veteran retiarius named Cassius, who had survived more than 20 arena contests. Cassius was lean and quick, with the weathered look of a man who had learned to live with constant danger. As they saluted each other before the fight began, Marcus saw neither hatred nor friendship in his opponent's eyes, only professional assessment and grim determination. The fight began with cautious circling as each gladiator tested the other's reflexes and tactics. Cassius wielded his weighted net with practiced ease, using it not just as a weapon but as a tool to control distance and disrupt Marcus's advances. The three-pronged trident darted forward in quick, precise strikes that forced Marcus to stay alert and defensive. Marcus's strategy was to close the distance and use his heavier armor and shield to his advantage, but Cassius was too experienced to allow this easily. The veteran gladiator used the entire arena as his battlefield, retreating and advancing in patterns that forced Marcus to chase him across the sand while avoiding the deadly net. The fight lasted nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in gladiatorial terms. Both men were exhausted, bleeding from numerous small wounds, and beginning to slow noticeably when Marcus finally managed to trap Cassius's net with his shield and close for the decisive exchange. The veteran's trident caught Marcus in the shoulder, but Marcus's sword found its mark first. As Cassius fell to the sand, the crowd's roar was deafening. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent, breathing heavily and waiting for the crowd's judgment. To his relief, the spectators were calling for mercy. Cassius had fought too well and too bravely to deserve death. The veteran gladiator would live to fight another day, though his fighting career was probably over. This first victory taught Marcus several important lessons about arena combat. Fighting skill was important, but so were stamina, tactics, showmanship, and luck. A gladiator who survived multiple contests needed all of these elements working in his favor, and even then, survival was never guaranteed. The periods between arena appearances were often the most psychologically challenging times for gladiators. During these stretches, which could last weeks or even months, they lived in a strange limbo between normal life and mortal combat. Marcus found that the uncertainty was almost worse than the fights themselves. He might wake up any morning to learn that he would be fighting that afternoon, or he might go months without seeing the inside of an arena. This unpredictability made it impossible to mentally prepare or to settle into any kind of routine that felt normal. During these quiet periods, gladiators tried to maintain their physical conditioning while also preserving their mental health. Some took up hobbies, writing, if they were literate, or crafts that could be practiced in their cells. Others focused on their relationships with fellow gladiators or even developed friendships with the guards and trainers who weren't themselves fighters. Marcus discovered that he had a talent for carving small figures from pieces of wood or bone. This hobby gave him something to do with his hands during the long evening hours and provided small gifts he could give to friends or trade for minor luxuries. The act of creating something beautiful in a world focused on destruction gave him a sense of purpose beyond his role as an entertainer. Some gladiators were allowed to marry and even have families, though these relationships were always overshadowed by the reality of their profession. A gladiator's wife lived with the constant knowledge that any day might bring news of her husband's death in the arena. Children of gladiators grew up understanding that their fathers were famous but might not live to see them reach adulthood. Religious observance provided comfort for many gladiators. Some continued to worship the gods of their homelands, while others adopted Roman deities or turned to the mystery religions that were popular throughout the empire. Prayer and ritual gave structure to their days and provided hope for an afterlife that might be better than their current existence. Medical care during these periods was crucial for maintaining the gladiators' value as fighters. Injuries from training or previous fights had to heal properly, and chronic conditions had to be managed carefully. The ludus physicians became intimately familiar with each gladiator's physical condition and worked constantly to keep their charges in fighting condition. As you drift deeper into peaceful sleep, remember that Doze Through History is here whenever you need a gentle journey through time. Please subscribe and let us know what historical topics help you find the most restful sleep. The world of gladiatorial combat included many different fighting styles and specializations, each with its own training requirements, equipment, and tactical approaches. Understanding these differences was crucial for any gladiator, as they needed to know how to fight against each type they might encounter in the arena. The heavily armored Murmillo, named for the fish-shaped crest on his helmet, was perhaps the most traditional type of gladiator. These fighters carried large rectangular shields and straight swords, relying on defensive tactics and powerful, precise strikes. Their armor was extensive but heavy, making them formidable opponents in direct combat, but vulnerable to more mobile fighting styles. The retiarius, or netman, represented the opposite approach to gladiatorial combat. Lightly armored and highly mobile, these fighters used a weighted net to entangle their opponents and a three-pronged trident for attacks. They also carried a dagger for close combat when their primary weapons failed them. The retiarius relied on speed, agility, and tactical cunning rather than brute force. The secutor, like Marcus, was specifically trained to fight against the retiarius. Their smooth, rounded helmets prevented nets from catching, and their tactics focused on closing distance rapidly to negate the retiarius's mobility advantage. The name secutor means chaser, reflecting their primary tactical role. Thracians fought with curved swords and small round shields, using quick, slashing attacks and superior mobility to overwhelm their opponents. Their fighting style was based on the actual combat techniques of Thracian warriors, adapted for arena combat to create visually exciting contests. The Hoplomachus carried a spear as his primary weapon, along with a small round shield and a sword for backup. These gladiators were trained to fight in a style reminiscent of Greek hoplite warriors, using their spears to maintain distance and control the pace of combat. When forced into close quarters, they had to rely on their secondary weapons and superior footwork. Some gladiators specialized in fighting from horseback, though these mounted contests were less common due to the expense of maintaining horses and the space requirements for equestrian combat. These gladiators needed skills in both riding and weapons handling, making them among the most versatile but also most difficult to train properly. The Dimacharists fought with two swords simultaneously, creating a whirlwind of attacks that could overwhelm opponents but required exceptional coordination and stamina. These gladiators were relatively rare, as the fighting style was extremely demanding and left little room for defensive tactics. Each fighting style had its strengths and weaknesses, and part of a gladiator's education involved learning to exploit the vulnerabilities of different opponent types while protecting his own weak points. This tactical knowledge could mean the difference between victory and defeat, life and death. While gladiatorial combat was predominantly a male profession, women also participated in the arena in various capacities. Female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, were rare but not unknown, and their appearances were considered exotic entertainment that drew special attention from crowds. Most gladiatrices were slaves or prisoners of war, like their male counterparts, though some were free women who had fallen into desperate circumstances or who were drawn by the potential rewards of successful arena combat. Their training was similar to that of male gladiators, though they often specialized in lighter armor and more agile fighting styles. The presence of women in the arena was controversial even in Roman society. Some viewed it as exciting entertainment, while others considered it undignified or contrary to proper Roman values. This controversy meant that female gladiators were often featured as novelty acts rather than as serious competitors, though some achieved genuine fame and success. Women also served important roles behind the scenes in gladiatorial schools. Some worked as medical assistants, helping to treat injured fighters and maintain their health. Others served as cooks, seamstresses, or in other support roles that kept the ludus functioning smoothly. The wives and daughters of gladiators lived lives shaped by the constant uncertainty of the arena. They formed their own support networks, helping each other cope with the stress of loving someone whose profession involved mortal combat. These women developed remarkable strength and resilience, creating stable homes and families despite circumstances that would challenge anyone. Some women became fans of particular gladiators, following their careers closely and even providing financial support or gifts. These relationships were complex, mixing genuine admiration with the excitement of proximity to danger and fame. Successful gladiators could attract devoted followings that included women from all levels of Roman society. Let your mind wander gently through these ancient lives, feeling the warmth of Roman sunshine and the distant murmur of crowds. As your breathing becomes deeper and more peaceful, the gladiatorial games were never just entertainment. They were powerful political tools that emperors, senators, and other ambitious Romans used to advance their careers and maintain social control. Understanding these political dimensions was crucial for anyone involved in the games, from the gladiators themselves to the sponsors who paid for the spectacles. Emperors used gladiatorial games to demonstrate their wealth and power, while also keeping the Roman population distracted from political and economic problems. The famous phrase "bread and circuses" captured this strategy perfectly: provide the people with food and entertainment, and they would be less likely to cause political trouble. For ambitious politicians, sponsoring successful games could launch careers and build popular support. A senator who put on particularly memorable games might find himself favored for higher offices or military commands. Conversely, games that disappointed the crowd could damage a sponsor's reputation and political prospects. Marcus learned that gladiators themselves could become unwitting participants in these political struggles. A gladiator who became too popular might find himself caught between competing political factions, each trying to use his fame for their own purposes. Some gladiators were even used as symbols in broader political movements or social causes. The crowd's reaction to particular gladiators or types of contests could reflect broader social and political tensions within Roman society. Support for foreign gladiators might indicate attitudes toward Rome's various conquered peoples, while preferences for certain fighting styles could reflect cultural values or regional loyalties. Emperors sometimes used gladiatorial games to make political statements or demonstrate their power. They might grant unusual pardons to defeated gladiators as shows of mercy, or they might stage elaborate spectacles to commemorate military victories or important anniversaries. These imperial games set standards that other sponsors tried to match or exceed. The political aspects of gladiatorial combat added another layer of complexity to an already challenging profession. Gladiators had to navigate not just the physical dangers of the arena, but also the shifting currents of Roman politics and social change. Success in this environment required intelligence and adaptability as much as fighting skill. As the Roman Empire evolved, so did the nature of gladiatorial combat. What had begun as relatively straightforward contests between skilled fighters gradually became more elaborate and spectacular, but also more removed from genuine martial skill and honor. Later gladiatorial games featured increasingly exotic elements, elaborate stage settings, complex mechanical devices, and even naval battles staged in flooded arenas. While these innovations were impressive from an engineering standpoint, they often reduced the gladiators to mere props in grand theatrical productions rather than respected warriors competing on equal terms. Marcus lived during what many considered the golden age of gladiatorial combat, when the emphasis was still on skill, courage, and honor rather than pure spectacle. Gladiators of his era were respected for their abilities and could achieve genuine fame through their prowess in combat. Later generations of gladiators would find themselves increasingly subordinated to elaborate special effects and crowd-pleasing gimmicks. The rise of Christianity also began to change attitudes toward gladiatorial combat. Early Christian writers criticized the games as barbaric and contrary to Christian values of compassion and human dignity. While it would take centuries for these attitudes to completely transform Roman entertainment, the seeds of change were already being planted during Marcus's lifetime. Economic factors also contributed to the gradual transformation of gladiatorial games. As the empire faced increasing financial pressures, the enormous expense of maintaining traditional gladiatorial schools became harder to justify. Cheaper alternatives, including condemned criminals forced to fight without training, began to replace skilled professional gladiators in many venues. These changes meant that the profession Marcus knew, dangerous but dignified, brutal but governed by codes of honor, would not last forever. The gladiatorial tradition would eventually fade away, leaving behind only memories and the ruins of great amphitheaters as testament to this unique chapter in human history. As we near the end of our journey through Marcus's world, take a moment to appreciate how peaceful and safe your own rest is tonight. If you're enjoying these travels through history, please subscribe to Doze Through History for more gentle adventures into the past. After 3 years in the Ludus and 7 victories in the arena, Marcus faced what would prove to be his final contest. His opponent was a young Gallic warrior named Brennus, recently captured in one of Rome's northern campaigns and still burning with the fury of defeat and captivity. This fight was different from Marcus's previous contests. Brennus fought not for entertainment or professional pride, but with the desperate courage of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose except his life. This made him both more dangerous and more unpredictable than the seasoned gladiators Marcus had faced before. The contest was fierce but brief. Both men fought with skill and determination, but Brennus's reckless aggression eventually created an opening that Marcus was trained to exploit. As his opponent fell to the sand, Marcus stood victorious once again, but he felt no triumph, only sadness for a brave young man whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond his control. The crowd called for mercy, moved by Brennus's courage and youth, and Marcus was glad to see the fallen gladiator spared. In the medical tent afterward, as the Ludus physician tended to his wounds, Marcus made a decision that had been building in his mind for months. Using the prize money from his victories and a small loan from his lanista, Marcus purchased his freedom. The wooden sword ceremony was simple but meaningful. After years of fighting with deadly weapons, he was finally handed a harmless piece of wood that represented his liberation from the arena. Marcus used his remaining money to travel to a small town in the countryside, far from Rome and its amphitheaters. There he opened a small school where he taught young men the arts of swordsmanship and self-defense, not for gladiatorial combat, but for personal protection and physical fitness. His students never knew that their mild-mannered instructor had once fought for his life in front of thousands of cheering spectators. In his quiet moments, Marcus would sometimes think about his years as a gladiator. The experience had been traumatic and dangerous, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about courage, friendship, and the preciousness of life. He had learned that honor could be found even in the most desperate circumstances, and that human beings could show remarkable kindness and strength even when facing their darkest moments. The scars on his body served as permanent reminders of his gladiatorial career, but they no longer defined him. He had survived what most men could not, and he had emerged from that experience with his humanity intact. In the end, perhaps that was victory enough. As you drift toward peaceful sleep tonight, consider Marcus's story and the harsh realities of gladiatorial life. Despite the occasional glory and the possibility of fame, the life of a gladiator was one of constant danger, uncertainty, and loss of personal freedom. The physical training was brutal, the living conditions were harsh, and the psychological burden of facing death regularly was enormous. Gladiators lived at the mercy of others, their owners, the crowd, the sponsors of the games, and the complex political forces that shaped Roman society. They formed deep friendships knowing they might be forced to fight their friends to the death. They trained constantly for contests that might never come, or that might come with only a day's notice. The medical care, while advanced for its time, was motivated by economics rather than compassion. The possibility of freedom, while real, was distant and uncertain. Even those who achieved liberation often found that their gladiatorial past followed them for the rest of their lives. Most importantly, gladiators lived with the constant knowledge that any day might be their last. This uncertainty, more than the physical dangers of combat, was perhaps the heaviest burden they carried. No amount of skill, preparation, or determination could guarantee survival in the arena. Luck played too large a role, and luck eventually runs out for everyone. So as you settle into your comfortable bed tonight, safe from the dangers that Marcus faced, appreciate the peace and security of your own life. The gladiators of ancient Rome provided entertainment for their audiences, but they paid for that entertainment with their freedom, their peace of mind, and often their lives. Their stories remind us that glory and fame are not worth the sacrifice of human dignity and basic safety. The arena may have been exciting to watch, but it was certainly not a place where anyone would choose to spend their life if they had any alternative. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of a Roman gladiator. If you found peace in this story, please like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History for more gentle travels through the past. Leave a comment letting me know what other historical topics you'd like to explore as you drift off to sleep. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful and undisturbed by the challenges that Marcus and his fellow gladiators faced so long ago. Until next time, this is Doze Through History, helping you find rest through the gentle exploration of our shared human past. Sleep well,